I never thought the happiest day of my life would turn into the most humiliating moment I'd ever experienced, all because of a dress and a group of rich people who thought money made them better than everyone else. In today's story, I'm going to tell you how my fiancé's wealthy family laughed at my cheap wedding dress, treated me like I was a joke, and how I quietly turned everything around, until they were the ones begging to be invited into my new life. If you enjoy long, emotional revenge stories where social class, pride, and karma collide, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay until the very end, because the way this story flips will be exactly the kind of justice you've always wanted to see. 2. Who I am, plus social background. My name is Laura, and I grew up on the wrong side of the city. At least that's how people from the rich part like to describe it. My parents worked hard their entire lives. My mom as a seamstress, repairing and altering clothes for neighbors, and my dad as a mechanic in a small garage. We never had luxury, but we had something I later realized the rich often lacked: respect and genuine love. I didn't grow up dreaming of a giant princess wedding. For me, the dream was simple: to have a stable life, a peaceful home, and a partner who wouldn't treat me like I was disposable. So when I met Ethan, I thought, for a while, that my dream had finally come true. We met at a marketing agency where I worked as an assistant, and he was a junior executive. He was charming, polite, and surprisingly humble for someone from a wealthy family. He rode a regular car, wore normal clothes, and never bragged about money. For the first 6 months of our relationship, I barely knew anything about his background except that his parents were comfortably well off. Comfortably well off, in his vocabulary, actually meant disgustingly rich. 3. Discovering his rich family. The first time I visited his parents' house, I understood the difference between normal rich and the level of wealth his family had. Their property looked like something out of a magazine: a long driveway with trimmed trees on each side, a fountain in front of a massive house with huge glass windows, and staff opening the door like it was a luxury hotel. I remember feeling small the moment I stepped onto that perfectly polished marble floor. Ethan squeezed my hand and whispered, "Don't worry, they'll love you." He was wrong. His mother, Margaret, scanned me from head to toe with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her jewelry alone probably cost more than my parents had ever earned in a year. She said, "So, this is Laura. Ethan told us you were sweet." The pause before sweet told me everything. In her language, it meant poor. At dinner, they asked where I was from, what my parents did, where I had gone to school. When I mentioned public schools and my mom's small sewing room, his father, Richard, gave a tight smile and said, "Ah, a self-made type. That's admirable." It sounded less like a compliment and more like a scientific observation of a rare animal. Still, I told myself they were just old-fashioned, that they would soften with time. I was very, very wrong. 4. The proposal and the dream dress. After 2 years of dating, Ethan proposed. He took me to a small restaurant, got down on one knee, and gave me a beautiful ring his grandmother had left him. I cried, said yes, and for a moment, none of the money or social class differences mattered. I thought, we love each other. That's enough. We started planning the wedding, and that's when the real problems began. Margaret insisted on being involved in every detail. She wanted an expensive venue, an exclusive guest list of rich families, a famous photographer, designer decorations, and a dress from a luxury bridal brand that cost more than my parents' house. I told her, politely but firmly, that I wanted something simpler. I wanted the ceremony to reflect who I was, not just impress her social circle. She laughed softly and said, "Oh, darling, weddings are not about what the bride wants. They're about what the guests will say afterwards." That sentence stayed in my head like a stain. My mom, who couldn't contribute with a lot of money, offered the one thing she had: her skill. She said with tears in her eyes, "If you want, I can make your wedding dress. It won't be designer, but it will be made with love." I didn't even hesitate. I hugged her and said yes. We spent weeks choosing fabric within our budget, cutting patterns, sewing, and adjusting. The dress wasn't enormous, it didn't have a famous label, and it didn't sparkle under every kind of light. But to me, it was perfect planning episode script. I'll aim for a total of 10 scripts. While a 25-minute script is on the longer side, The user tends to prefer concise answers but acknowledges that length can be necessary for scripts. I'll craft a reasonably long story rather than a huge novel, and I should label it as Season 1, Episode 2, title. The narration should be female voice, focusing on a poor protagonist bride seeking revenge. I'll write in English but can use Portuguese for commentary headings. Let's move forward. Abaixo vou seguir exatamente o padrão que combinamos. Season 1, Episode 2, They laughed at my cheap wedding dress, so I made them beg to be invited. Narração, voz feminina, roteiro em inglês. Season 1, Episode 2, Opening plus CTA initial. I never thought a piece of fabric could reveal so much about how people truly see you. In today's story, I'm going to tell you how my fiancé's rich family and their mocked my cheap wedding dress, treated me like an embarrassment, and tried to turn my own wedding into a status show. And how, in the end, I made them beg just to be invited to the one event they thought they controlled. If you enjoy long, emotional revenge stories where class, pride, and cruelty collide, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me until the very end, because the way this story turns around is something they never expected, but I had been quietly planning all along. My name is Laura, and I did not grow up with silk sheets, designer handbags, or family vacations in Europe. I grew up in a small apartment above a noisy street, with a mother who worked in a bakery and a father who fixed broken appliances in our living room just to keep food on the table. My childhood birthdays were homemade cakes, borrowed decorations, and secondhand clothes that Mom carefully washed and ironed until they looked almost new. We didn't have a lot, but we had something that, at the time, I thought everyone had. Love, respect, and the belief that your value as a person has nothing to do with the price tag on your clothes. I carried that belief into adulthood. I studied hard, worked part-time jobs, and eventually got a position as an assistant at a mid-sized company. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and I was proud of every bill I paid with my own money. That's where I met Daniel. He was one of the junior managers, polite, quiet, and surprisingly down-to-earth for someone who always seemed to have the nicest clothes, the newest phone, and never worried about overtime. We started talking over coffee breaks, then having lunch together, then staying late at the office, finishing projects that were really just excuses to be around each other. For months, I assumed he was just comfortable. I could tell he wasn't worried about money in the way I was, but he never flaunted anything or made me feel small. He treated me like an equal, like someone who mattered. So when he asked me to be his girlfriend, then later to be his wife, I said yes without even thinking twice. I didn't realize back then that I wasn't just marrying him. I was about to collide headfirst with the world he came from. Daniel didn't talk much about his family at first. He said they were busy, complicated, and very focused on appearances. I assumed that meant they liked to host fancy dinners and had strong opinions about which fork to use. The first time I went to his parents' house, I realized how naive I had been. They didn't live in a house. They lived in something that looked like a magazine cover, a huge mansion with stone columns, a circular driveway, a fountain in the middle, and a security gate that opened only after a camera scanned our license plate. The garden looked like something maintained by a team of professionals, which, of course, it was. Inside, it was even more overwhelming. Marble floors, chandeliers, paintings that looked too serious to be fake, and a staircase that probably cost more than my entire childhood home. His mother, Catherine, met us in the foyer. She was tall, elegant, and perfectly put together. Not a hair out of place, not a single wrinkle in her dress. Her perfume reached me before her smile, and both felt a little too strong. She looked at me the way someone looks at a dress on a clearance rack, scanning it quickly, assessing, already deciding it's not worth much. "So, you're Laura," she said, her tone polite but distant. Her eyes flicked over my simple blouse and shoes. Daniel had told me to dress nice but casual, and I had done my best with what I had. His father, Edward, appeared a few minutes later, still on a phone call about some investment. He barely shook my hand before asking Daniel, in front of me, "Is this serious, or is this just a phase?" That was my introduction to the family I was supposed to become part of. Despite their attitude, Daniel proposed to me 6 months later, in a small park where we used to sit on our lunch breaks. He got down on one knee with a ring that was simple but beautiful. And I cried because, in that moment, it felt like love was bigger than any difference between our worlds. When we announced the engagement, his parents congratulated us, but their smiles never reached their eyes. Catherine insisted on hosting an engagement party at their mansion, and I naively thought this was her way of accepting me. It wasn't. At the party, their friends, lawyers, doctors, business owners, wealthy socialites, looked at me like some kind of charity case. They asked me where I was from, what my parents did, what school I went to. Every answer made their eyebrows go a little higher. At one point, I overheard one woman whisper to another, "She's pretty, at least. Maybe they can polish her up before the wedding." They both laughed softly, clinking their champagne glasses. Catherine spent the whole evening introducing me as Daniel's fiancé, Laura. She's from a very humble background, as if that were my job title. By the time we left, I felt like I had been put on display and silently judged by every person in that house. Still, I thought, it's just one night. The wedding will be about us. I was wrong again. I always dreamed of choosing my own wedding dress. Not a dress from a palace, not a designer gown, just something that felt like me. Simple, beautiful, and full of meaning. Knowing our budget was limited, I didn't even think about the big fancy bridal boutiques in the rich part of town. Instead, my mother and I went to a small shop run by an older woman who had been sewing dresses for decades. The store smelled like fabric and memories, and the dresses hung not in perfect rows, but in a way that felt human. When I tried on the dress that would become my dress, I knew immediately. It was ivory with lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that made me feel like I could float. It wasn't covered in crystals or beads, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw a bride who was honest, hopeful, and fully herself. The price was within what I had saved from my job. I paid for it in full, and the seamstress promised to make small adjustments to me perfectly. For me, that dress wasn't cheap. It was an achievement. It was something I had paid for with my own work, without asking anyone for help. I didn't realize then how much that would matter. Catherine, of course, had other plans. A week later, she invited me, or rather, summoned me, to go with her to see some proper wedding options. Daniel couldn't go because of work, and she made it clear this was something we women had to handle. She took me to an exclusive bridal boutique in the richest neighborhood of the city. There was a doorman, champagne for the clients, and dresses that cost more than a year of my salary. As we walked through the showroom, she spoke loudly enough for the staff to hear, "Daniel deserves the best. Our family name will be attached to this wedding forever. We'd have it looking cheap." One of the saleswomen smiled at me with professional politeness and started showing us dresses with long trains, heavy beadwork, and price tags that made my stomach tighten. When Catherine asked me which ones I liked, I was honest. They're beautiful, but they're way out of my budget. I've already chosen my dress from another place. She froze for a second, then turned to me with a slow, cold smile. "Oh? And where did you buy it?" I told her. Her eyebrows lifted in barely disguised horror. Neighborhood seamstress?" she repeated. "And how much was this dress of yours, Laura?" I told her the price. It was not a trivial amount for me, but in her world, it was practically nothing. She let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they hear a bad joke. The saleswoman at her side tried to hide a smirk. "Well," Catherine said, turning back to the racks of dresses, "that might be fine for your side of the family. But our guest will expect something a little more refined." A few days later, we had a family dinner at the mansion. Daniel, his parents, his younger sister, and a couple of close family friends were there. The kind of dinner where everyone dresses up just to sit at a table and be quietly cruel to each other. At some point, the conversation turned to wedding preparations. The guest list, the venue, the decorations, then, inevitably, the dress. Catherine, with a perfectly innocent tone, said, "Laura has already chosen her dress. Isn't that right, dear?" Everyone looked at me. I nodded, smiling softly, and said, "Yes, I found something I really love." Her lips curved. "She bought it from a small local seamstress," she added, emphasizing the word small like it was a crime. "It was... how much again?" I felt a knot in my stomach. I mentioned the amount quietly. One of the family friends, a woman who wore a watch that cost more than my car, laughed and said, "That's less than what I paid for my shoes." Another chimed in, "Oh, how adorable, very rustic. Maybe it will look authentic in the photos." Even Daniel's sister, who had always been distant but not openly hostile, glanced at me and covered a smile behind her napkin. Someone joked, "At least people will see the difference between the bride and the guests. It might be hard for them to tell otherwise." The table erupted in soft, polite laughter, the kind of laughter that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. I sat there, my face burning, my hands trembling under the tablecloth. I looked at Daniel, silently begging him to say something, anything. He shifted uncomfortably and said, "The dress doesn't matter. What matters is that Laura is happy." But his voice was weak. He didn't push back. He didn't defend me the way I hoped he would. In that moment, I realized something very important. In their eyes, I was a joke. And my wedding, my day, was just another opportunity for them to display their wealth and superiority. That night, I cried in the bathroom with the shower running so no one would hear me. Not just because they laughed at my dress, but because they laughed at everything it represented. My work, my background, my identity. I thought about canceling the wedding. I thought about walking away from Daniel, from his family, from all of it. But then something else took root inside me. Not despair, but something colder, sharper. I decided I wouldn't run. I would marry the man I loved, but I would do it on my terms. If his family wanted to turn my wedding into a spectacle of social status, I would show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the girl you think is beneath you. I started planning. Quietly, carefully, without telling them. Catherine wanted a huge, fancy ceremony at a luxury venue where her friends could pose for photos and talk about how generous, elegant, and important her family was. She insisted on handling most of the planning because you don't have much experience with events like this, dear. I let her, outwardly. She talked about a guest list of over 300 people, a custom cake, a famous photographer, a live band. She negotiated with vendors, posted hints on social media, and proudly told everyone how involved she was in making our wedding worthy of the family name. Meanwhile, I was planning a different wedding, a real one. I spoke to my parents, my closest friends, and a small venue near the place where I had grown up, a charming little garden attached to a modest events hall. We chose a date 1 week before the big fancy ceremony Catherine was arranging. Legally, that was the date we would sign the papers. That would be the actual wedding. The big event with guests would become something else entirely. I didn't tell Daniel at first because I needed to be sure he was actually on my side, not just floating between us. Over time, I began to see that he was tired of his parents' control, but too used to their money to imagine a different life. So I gave him a choice. One evening, I asked Daniel to meet me at my parents' apartment instead of his parents' mansion. We sat at the same small table where my mother had served us coffee 100 times. I looked him in the eyes and asked, "Do you want to marry me? Or do you want to marry the idea your parents have of what your life should look like?" He frowned, confused. "Of course I want to marry you, Laura. Why would you even ask that?" "Because your mother is planning a wedding for herself," I replied, my voice calm but steady. "And you're letting her. She laughs at my dress, at my family, at where I come from. Your father openly questions if I'm good enough. And you just sit there and let it happen." He looked guilty, then defensive. "You know how they are. It's complicated. I don't want to fight with them all the time." I nodded slowly. "Then let me make it simple. I'm organizing a small ceremony with the people who actually respect us. It will be legal, real, and ours. Your parents are not invited. Neither are their friends. If you want to marry me, that's where you'll be that day." "And the other wedding?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "The other one will be a show, a very expensive, very public show, but it won't be a wedding." He stared at me for a long moment. Then something shifted in his eyes, a mix of fear, recognition, and, maybe for the first time, respect. After a long silence, he said, "I'll be wherever you are. Tell me what you need me to do." The real wedding happened on a sunny afternoon, 1 week before the big event his mother had planned. I wore my cheap dress, It had been carefully adjusted by the seamstress, and when I looked in the mirror, it fit me like it had been made for my soul, not just my body. My mother cried when she saw me. My father hugged me like he was both proud and terrified of letting me go. My friends wore simple clothes, but their smiles lit up the entire room. Daniel arrived in a modest suit that he had chosen himself, not something picked by his father's tailor. He looked nervous, but when he saw me, he smiled in that real, unguarded way that he rarely let his family see. We said our vows in front of a small group of people who knew our names, our stories, and our hearts. There were no chandeliers, no string quartets, no expensive decorations, just flowers from a local market, a simple cake, and genuine joy. We signed the marriage certificate that day. Legally, officially, we became husband and wife. None of his parents' friends were there. None of the people who laughed at my dress even knew. A week later, Catherine's masterpiece took place. The grand wedding she had poured her time, money, and ego into. There was a massive hall decorated with white roses and crystals, a dance floor, a live band, and a photographer who had worked with celebrities. Guests arrived in designer clothes, greeted by waiters with trays of champagne. Catherine walked around greeting everyone like a queen hosting a royal ball. She smiled, posed for photos, and accepted compliments on her generosity and attention to detail. There was only one problem. The bride and groom were late, very late. Daniel and I had agreed to arrive together, but not in the way they expected. We showed up almost an hour after the official start time. When we walked in, arm in arm, Catherine rushed towards us, her face tight with anger, hidden behind a strained smile. "Where have you two been?" she hissed under her breath. "Do you know how many important people are here waiting for you?" I looked around the room, then back at her. "I see a lot of your friends," I said calmly. "I don't see many of mine." Before she could answer, someone nearby commented loudly, "Where's the wedding dress? Aren't we going to see the bride in something more appropriate?" I smiled. "I already wore my wedding dress," I said. "Our real wedding was last week. This isn't a ceremony. This is just a party." For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, like a wave, the murmur started. "What? Last week? Did you know about this?" People turned to Catherine, eyes wide, whispering. Catherine's face went pale, then red. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "This is the wedding. The papers haven't been signed yet. We planned everything." Daniel interrupted her, his voice louder than I had ever heard it in that house. "No, Mom. You planned everything. We signed the papers last week with the people we actually wanted by our side. You weren't there because you were too busy treating wife like she was beneath you." The word wife hung in the air like a small explosion. A few of the guests looked uncomfortable. Others looked almost entertained, like they were watching a scandal unfold live. Later that night, when many guests had quietly left and the band was playing to half a room, Catherine cornered me near the hallway. "How dare you humiliate us like this?" she spat, her perfect mask of politeness finally cracking. "Do you realize who was here tonight? Do you understand the damage you've caused to our reputation?" I held her gaze steadily. "You were happy to humiliate me in front of those same people when you laughed at my dress," I replied. "You didn't think about my dignity then. You only thought about your image." She took a breath, trying to regain control. "You should have told us about that other event," she said, forcing a calmer tone. "We should have been there. People are asking why we weren't invited. It makes us look terrible." I tilted my head slightly. "If you had wanted to be at my real wedding," I said slowly, "you should have treated me like a real person, not like a project, not like a punchline." She stared at me, seething but trapped. For the first time, she understood something deeply uncomfortable. She couldn't control everything anymore. In the weeks that followed, I heard from a few of her friends that she had tried to downplay what happened, claiming it was a misunderstanding or a legal formality they did earlier. But the story had already spread. Her son had married without her, and the poor girl she mocked had chosen to exclude her from the moment that actually mattered. More than once, she reached out, trying to repair the relationship. Not because she had suddenly developed respect for me, but because being excluded from important family moments made her look bad in her circle. In other words, she ended up begging, in her own prideful way, to be invited to the parts of our life that truly counted. Sometimes, the best revenge is not screaming, or throwing things, or trying to outspend someone. Sometimes, the best revenge is quietly building something real without them, and letting them watch from the outside. If you felt the same mix of anger, satisfaction, and quiet justice that I did living this story, tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Would you have canceled the big event, confronted them earlier, or done something even more drastic? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that their value is not defined by how much their dress costs, and that sometimes the most powerful answer is choosing who gets to be part of your moments, and who doesn't. And if you want more long, emotional revenge stories about class differences, toxic in-laws, and quiet victories, stay tuned. Season 1 has many more episodes coming.